It is March 1st, 1954. 23 men are on board the Japanese fishing vessel the Lucky Dragon No. 5. They had been fishing for weeks out in the Pacific but had little luck near Midway, so turned their sights to Bikini Atoll. In the early morning hours of that fateful day, as the men were fast asleep miles from the atoll, suddenly a bright light shone from over the horizon. But it wasn't the sun. The few men who had been on deck, though they didn't yet realize it, had witnessed the single most powerful nuclear detonation conducted by the United States, Castle Bravo. 9 minutes after the initial blast, one of the crewmen recorded hearing the shockwaves of the blast cascading across the Pacific waves for hundreds of miles. However, when it was over, and the light faded into the dark dawn, all seemed fine. That was until several hours later when ash began to fall from the sky. When they returned home, the crew was given skin ointment to treat a weird affliction they had experienced on the journey back to the mainland. Headaches turned to dizziness, which turned to blisters. Finally, when the ointment failed and some members of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 began to panic over their symptoms, 7 of them were sent to Tokyo University Hospital, where they underwent treatment for their apparent depletion of white blood cells. It quickly became obvious to the doctors treating them that the ash they speak of was connected to their condition, and when they took samples of the Lucky Dragon itself, they realized they had been irradiated. It was only later that the public began to hear of the mysterious case of the Lucky Dragon, and along with it the fact it had encountered the nuclear fallout of the Castle Bravo test. What became clear was that the United States had failed to accurately predict how large the nuclear test would be, ending in a blast that was more than 2 times its predicted size. Wind blew fallout far from the danger zone, impacting not just the Lucky Dragon, but 15 islands, which were all evacuated, displacing thousands. The story quickly riled up the public, specifically in Japan, which wasn't even 10 years out from the nuclear devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At that time, a young Japanese producer, Tomoyuki Tanaka, was on his way back from Indonesia after a failed film pitch when, after reading about the Lucky Dragon in the paper, got an idea. Upon returning to Tokyo, Tanaka partnered with special effects master Eiji Tsuburaya, director Ishiro Honda, and Shigeru Kayama to create a movie not only capitalizing on, but capturing the Japanese public's very real fear of nuclear weapons. Only a few months later, in October, the first Godzilla movie was released. The film was a resounding success for Tanaka and his studio, Toho. With a budget of only $900,000, the studio not only made back its investment, but gained another $1 million. Godzilla itself spoke to the audience, many of whom had personally experienced either the terror or atomic bombings of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo. Devastation was still fresh in the Japanese psyche, and Godzilla was one of the first domestic films to speak out about the scars nuclear war left behind. Much of the film is dedicated to the horror of Godzilla itself. A beast summoned by hellfire, it's speculated by the characters that Godzilla destroys Tokyo as revenge for its creation, punishing humanity for playing with incomprehensible power. No one is spared in his rampage. The movie doesn't hold any punches. From the very beginning, a cruise ship is sunk by Godzilla, a reference to the Lucky Dragon incident, and much of real-world Tokyo at the time was replicated perfectly on set, just to be destroyed. People are shown burning or falling from great heights or cowering in fear. In one scene, a mother clings to her children, trying to comfort them as death itself looms overhead. After its iconic march through Tokyo, much of the imagery director Ishiro Honda utilizes in the wake of Godzilla is reminiscent of what Tokyo looked like only 9 years earlier. Rubble everywhere, mangled metal stretching out across the horizon, fires consuming whatever there is left to burn. When the movie brings us into the crowded hospitals, filled with crying children and corpses, it's obvious what inspiration Honda drew from. Survivors are left sprawled out on the floor, not unlike what victims of the bombing of Hiroshima went through to receive treatment. While not explicitly shown, the scars survivors developed from the bomb were extremely painful and enveloped much of the body. Here, in these scenes, people are supposed to be receiving the same treatment, solidifying Godzilla as the very essence of a nuclear weapon. Of course, eventually, this great horror is defeated. An equally destructive yet unexplainable device called the Oxygen Destroyer is used in Tokyo Bay on the creature, killing its inventor with it so that the device may never be used in warfare. The end, and all is well. Godzilla ends with one of the main characters remarking that if mankind does not stop meddling in nuclear science, another Godzilla may arise and take revenge yet again. And another definitely did. Only a year later, in 1955, Godzilla Raids Again was released to theaters, banking off of the success of the first film. Just as rushed as the original, the special effects are about on par with its predecessor, except for the new Godzilla suit, for some reason. Much of Godzilla Raids Again is a retread of the last movie, with a second Godzilla awakened by atomic testing, along with a new rival, named Anguirus. The two do battle after they wake up, and eventually make their way to Osaka this time, instead of Tokyo. Godzilla Raids Again is much less focused on the themes of the last film. Whereas Godzilla had nuclear annihilation front and center, the theme takes a backseat in Godzilla Raids Again, so the audience can watch the two monsters battle it out. Even when atomic bombs are brought up, it's only in the context of the monster's origins, and none of the first film's motifs make their way into the sequel. No eerily familiar shots of Osaka, nor any metaphor for Japan's Cold War fears. Godzilla eventually ends up killing Anguirus and is buried in an iceberg by the film's main characters. All is well again, but the movie doesn't end with Godzilla's death, not this time. While the franchise would be put on hiatus for the next few years, the plan was to not kill the second Godzilla in case Toho ever wanted to bring it back to keep the money flowing. Very quickly, Godzilla went from artistic expression of pain and guilt to another B-movie monster. The rest of what Godzilla fans call the Showa era, from 1954 to 1975, followed a similar pattern to this. When Godzilla was brought back for a crossover with King Kong in 1962, nuclear existentialism wasn't even a theme, and the atomic bomb got a passing mention. However, in 1964, Mothra vs. Godzilla had a slight environmental theme, with the monster Mothra's home island being devastated by nuclear testing. Greedy Japanese businessmen are the main antagonists of the film, trying to take advantage of Mothra's suffering by turning her unborn egg into a tourist attraction. While the film is far more comedic and campy than what Godzilla once was, Mothra vs. Godzilla by no means forgets its thematic origins. And then Toho forgot. Again. Not even a year later, the film Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, was released to theaters and centers around the titular monster of King Ghidorah. Hailing from Mars, or Venus depending on the translation, King Ghidorah arrives on Earth to destroy it in a very 60s sci-fi plot. However, Godzilla, Mothra, and returning Toho monster Rodan join forces to defeat the dragon. By this point, this was the Godzilla franchise's farthest departure from the original. Now Godzilla was saving the Earth from alien monsters, and whatever remained of its nuclear birth are so overshadowed by the wacky plot that it doesn't really matter. When Godzilla goes to space in Invasion of Astro Monster the next year, it truly doesn't matter anymore. In the span of a decade, Godzilla went from a symbol of the horrors of nuclear war to a spacefaring dinosaur anti-hero. There's a reason for this. Godzilla didn't just transition into a Saturday morning camp-filled children's franchise because it was profitable, though that was definitely part of it. In 1954, it had been less than a decade since the Second World War. By the time Godzilla was battling a giant robotic version of itself in 1974, it had been an entire generation. The original audience of the first movie were either people who had witnessed the events of the war firsthand and in some cases had been victims of it, or their children who had heard stories and no doubt had their childhoods greatly impacted by the conflict. Those same children grew up in the time it took Toho to revive Godzilla in the 60s, and by the end of that decade, many were having children of their own. Godzilla was becoming a legacy franchise, similar to how Star Wars evolved in America. Godzilla was something young adults would see advertised in the later Showa era and think about how they had seen the original first few installments when they were younger. Now it was time to show their kids something they grew up on. As Godzilla got goofier and goofier, and the franchise leaned even further away from what Tomoyuki Tanaka first had envisioned so many years prior, the special effects started to visually deteriorate. With the transition to color, less profit from each successive film, and Tsuburai's departure from the Godzilla franchise in 1966, the effects that had struck fear into millions slowly became cheesy, and today extremely outdated. Luckily, kids didn't care. They were the primary audience of these movies now, along with Americans who had an odd thirst for B-movies at the time. So, to appeal further to children, Son of Godzilla was released in 1967, where, of course, Godzilla had a son. Named Manila by the fanbase, short for Mini Godzilla, he's remembered as one of the most hated characters in the entire franchise. His costume is uncanny, his voice is odd, and the entire film is another fever dream plastered onto the big screen. The only other film he's featured in as a main character in the Showa era is All Monsters Attack in 1969. and it's probably the most hated Godzilla film ever. At that time, Toho was running out of funds for the franchise. Destroy All Monsters the previous year lost around $20 million at the box office, and Toho was already in a tight financial spot. So, that year's Godzilla decided to rely heavily on stock footage, reuse old Godzilla and Manila costumes, and feature a story that takes place in the real world. Godzilla barely featured in All Monsters Attack. Instead, the film placed Godzilla into the mind of a small boy who daydreamed really about his adventures with Manila rather than Godzilla to escape the real world. Godzilla fans usually deride All Monsters Attack as one of the worst in the franchise and point directly to Manila and the child acting in the film as the single two worst problems with it. The Godzilla movies had been using recycled stock footage for a while, so while still cheap, it isn't entirely unexpected. However, the presence of Manila and the fact that he now speaks is one of the weirdest choices taken thus far. If Godzilla had departed from its roots before, now it had dug them up and thrown them away. But there's something about Godzilla's evolution that isn't usually discussed when talking about the campiness of the Showa era. Tanaka, after all these years, was still producing each and every entry, and would continue to do so until his death in 1997. Honda returned to direct not just Ghidorah, but Invasion of Astro Monster and even All Monsters Attack. Both King Ghidorah and Manila were Tanaka's ideas, and the special effects by this point weren't being done by just anybody. Tsuburaya had passed down the special effects directorial torch to his student, Sadamasa Arikawa. The same people who were working on these cheesy films were the same people who made that first movie in 1954. Despite the apparent drop in quality, there was still heart in these movies. Godzilla hadn't actually lost what made it special. It still had all the great minds it once had working on the franchise, and the serious tone of the original had merely passed with the times. Japan was now a bustling economy, rivaling much of the Western world, and it had already shed much of its imperial past. Those who could remember Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Tokyo were growing old, and they weren't the ones going to the theaters constantly. It was the youth. So Godzilla changed with the times. Just like how Japan adopted Western liberalism, Toho adopted Western filmography. Godzilla became goofy. It became a symbol not of war, but heroics. Destroy All Monsters truly shifted the course of Godzilla. Up until then, Godzilla was defeating other monsters not because it was saving people, but because it was protecting itself. Even in Invasion of Astro Monster, Godzilla fights with Rodan against King Ghidorah because he's vengeful against it. This all changed with Destroy All Monsters, where Godzilla teams up with a cast of some of Toho's most famous monsters to defeat King Ghidorah once and for all and save the world. Godzilla is the one to destroy the alien race plotting Earth's destruction because now, Godzilla was the hero of the story. At this point, Godzilla has already begun leading a parental role for Manila and then becomes the idol of a young boy. In Godzilla vs. Hedorah, he fights against pollution in another environmental message. An amusement park is built in Godzilla's image, characters are surprised when Godzilla attacks a factory, something they seem to think he'd never do, and when it's revealed it's a mechanical imposter, it makes much more sense to them. Godzilla by now is a complete force for good. Entire films now pit monsters against Godzilla, not just to watch them fight, like in Godzilla Raids Again, but because it's satisfying to watch them get beat up by this national hero. Somehow, Japan was able to take a symbol for complete, absolute destruction and within 20 years mold it into the protector of mankind. While many Godzilla fans might find the later films to be too cheesy, or on the nose, or too bland, there's something to be said about Godzilla's ability to evolve with the times. Since the Showa era, Godzilla has gone through 3 more eras, each as varied and unique as the last. In the Heisei era, Godzilla started yet again as an unstoppable, malevolent force and, by the end of the series, helped in saving the planet. In 2014, a new American Godzilla found itself in the spotlight, and also following in that familiar pattern. It started as a brooding force of nature, and now fights alongside Kong to save the world yet again. There's nothing more beautiful than the Godzilla franchise's ability to adapt and renew itself. If Godzilla must be campy again, so be it. If Godzilla must be serious again, so be it. But Godzilla will always stand as a symbol of what people need in the moment, either an expression of their pain or something to laugh along with.